No, I really appreciate what you said, and I have a lot of questions, but the first one that I have is kind of to clarify a little bit that turning point, right? Because it seems to me that at a certain point, so let me give you a scenario. Why isn't it that in this quest to find the source of this morality, Catholicism isn't just a religion that happens to hit upon that very true moral nature that human beings, for a lot of different reasons, have access to, like math, right? So it's a truth of reality. But there's a leap, it seems to me, from morality as a truth of reality to Jesus is the Son of God, flesh, the infinite in a glass of water, right? I mean, how does that leap happen, and what was the step for you from the moral law, which you could comprehend, to the mystery become flesh, which seems to be a little bit more incomprehensible?
Well, so the answer is I kind of made that leap ahead of time in a lot of small steps. So, as I said, I got to the point where I thought Catholicism was consistent before I thought it was true. So it was a lot of small things rather than any one big turning point that made me think that if there were a God, then that God was probably, the God of the Trinity, the God of Christ, and the God of the Catholic Church. And it was a range of things, everything from kind of the Catholic Church being right on both some moral questions and philosophical questions by talking about the Chesterton truth-telling thing, especially kind of on the whole virtue ethics way of seeing the world and a lot of choices that fall out of that. And then questions kind of about the divinity of Christ, and what I'm talking about there, the sense of goodness offering itself to us, sounds a lot more like the incarnation than it does like a number of other ways of describing the relationship God has with us. And then there were a lot of things, particularly about Catholicism within Christianity, that caused me to trust that particular church if I were going to grant Christianity in general, which again ranged from things like the way the Catholic Church treats the Eucharist. There's an extent to which, especially from the outside, what you see sometimes in Protestant churches of having quasi-Eucharistic communion, but where it's wholly symbolic, where it's just like, and then we come together and we share bread and wine, because that's pretty nice. Which is the way some churches represent it. That part's not a straw man. Now I'm going to get to the part where it sounds insulting. Just to be clear, that first part was not meant to be. It looks like from the outside, like an appendix, right? It looks like the shriveled part of something that was there, that you'd start with the actual belief of Christ in the Eucharist and wind up with this, but you wouldn't really go the other way around. You wouldn't go, and then we get together. No one would imagine that my Catholic Church's coffee and donuts after church would become the center point of a schismatic Catholic sect that made it the heart of their mass. It's much weirder imagining it going the other way. And so none of those things are by themselves definitive. I don't have kind of one essential truth that points to Catholicism, but it was a lot of small things like that, of varying levels of accessibility, I guess, insultingness sounding about other denominations.
So then, just as a follow-up to that, if you were to look around at the kind of current and modern generation, right? So your friends, those people younger than you, those people coming up, whether they have this kind of passion for morality and for objectivity and for truth or not, what makes it capable for someone formed in this culture with all of the various modifications of that to say, yes, I believe that Jesus is not only a nice idea, a good moral teacher, but that he is in flesh, God himself who came to us. What makes that credible to the world that we live in?
So I'll give two parts of an answer to this, because I think they're kind of two things that help a lot. One is having a vivid idea of what it means to say that. And that is what I'm talking about with my friends, kind of giving me the gift of their own lives and their own choices, so I could see what Catholicism was like at the scale of a human life, rather than just at the scale of a philosophical claim. So something can be vivid enough to either desire or reject, but in a way that you have stronger and more specific and hopefully more accurate feelings than I think everyone in this room does about Zoroastrianism. I think the other thing that goes with that is just the expectation that it is important to answer questions at that higher level I was talking about. That there is an urgency that's particular to the questions of how we know morality, of how we come to understand the world, and that those questions in our culture today haven't been settled to people's satisfaction. So you can't trust the consensus in your own small culture or among your friends or among popular writers as easily on this topic as you can on, honestly, on evolution, on the Higgs boson, on any number of other empirical questions. And that when you have the combination of uncertainty about how we approach ethics and the sense of how unbelievably high the stakes are, I think, again, with the sense of curiosity, what draws you on to answer these questions, for me, that is it, right? This is really important to settle. It's one of the most important questions in my life. So what's next?
Take your questions.
Interesting talk. The question is, I also came to Christianity not by conversion. I'm a Jewish person, and I had gotten involved with a Baptist minister under Dr. King, Dr. Timothy Mitchell. They one time got clean, that's it, and started going through his sermons, got involved with him politically, actually. And he kind of introduced me in a very tangible way to Jesus, whom I had previously heard of. And I decided to get baptized. And my question, I was very nervous about that because I had thought he was going to say to me, he said, well, let's talk about it first. And because it was going to be in front of this old church, it's a big black church, major, whatever. And I was one of a very small minority group of white Jewish people in the church. And so I was nervous about it because I thought he was going to say, well, you choose it. It's them or us. Mm-hmm. And so we talked about it. He said, no, it's not a problem. And so, because I said I didn't want to abandon my own faith, I just wanted to, sort of as Jesus did it. He didn't go into the water and say, I'm a Christian. He was a rabbi. So my question is, since yours is different, you came from atheism, which is more of an escape than a conversion. What do you think about that? I mean, I don't think I'm the only person that did that, but and I also go to a synagogue. I live in Staten Island, which is kind of an outpost in New York City, and the reactions there have been positive and negative. So I was just wondering what you thought about that.
So I think it's a mistake to characterize atheism as coming from nothing. It's coming from a catch-all category that is defined by people not believing in God, but then has a wild diversity of viewpoints and philosophies within it. And so, telling you I was an atheist tells you what I didn't believe. Telling you I was a deontologist, Neoplatonist, tells you what I did believe. And I think people coming to Catholicism from any number of philosophical or theological traditions, the promise the church really makes is that whatever was true or beautiful that attracted you, that was good about where you were, you'll find its fullness here. And that means often for people coming from a number of traditions, it doesn't mean rejecting everything you've known or everything you've loved. It means kind of finding the full expression of that goodness and admiring what was good that was recognized in your tradition.
Thank you very much for a great talk. I just find it fascinating that somebody who would be raised in a very secular environment would have this unshakable belief in moral realism. And I'm just wondering, where do you think that came from? I mean, it's because I was kind of in a spot there as well with the real romantic, I'm going to do my duty no matter what, the sort of the knightly, about honor. And it's very Chestertonian as well. So I'm wondering, where do you think you sort of picked that up, and how prevalent is that? Because I'm actually seeing a little bit, I think it's more prevalent among very active, liberal young people. This is clearly the right way to go. Even as a Catholic, I see you are wrong on almost every position you're saying, but I admire your belief in it, that you haven't totally sold on that. So I wonder, were you where this real rock foundation of that came from?
Yeah, it's a little hard for me to answer because moral realism seems like the most obvious fact about the world, and then it's hard. I didn't have a time before I believed it. But if I'm going to look for things that could have helped me get to that point, aside from Les Mis, it's Stars. It's just a beautiful song. But I think it's definitely the case that my parents are a big part of that. My parents are secular humanists, and they care intensely about the good. Like, I could take them out and wave them at people who are like, oh yeah, atheists don't believe in morality. And like, no, atheists have incorrect metaphysics about morality. Like, many atheists believe in morality and give their lives to it. Yeah, and make sacrifices.
That's what I find fascinating.
And I think what my parents really had is both kind of a strong sense of, the good, and a strong sense of duty, though not to my weird excesses, but a sense of responsibility. And honestly, I don't know, this is one thing I took from it, a sense of power, that I actually have a lot of ability to shape the world around me. That a lot of, what we miss is our ability to affect the world, but largely at the political level and personally. And they're activists, and they raised me with kind of a firm confidence that I could do a lot to shape the world around me, which to me meant it was really important I know that I was right when I was doing that. Because I firmly expected I would change the world, which meant I should really try and do that for the good.
Sort of follow-up question to that, because I come from an opposite tradition. I was raised in a very believing Christian family, and I found morality utterly unconvincing. And I still do. And so what I find interesting about Christianity is that it's managed to keep me here, despite the fact that I find the moral positions boring and confusing. Yet, I find Jesus fascinating and willing to follow him and try out all of these moral conventions, despite the fact that at some level, and I don't know what it is, maybe it's as likely that I'm born in a moral Christian family as that, somebody would find faith born in a non-Christian family, but or at least find morality. And so my question is that at some level, despite the people who loved Jesus were not the moral people. Those people found a lot of objections to him. They found him to be quite immoral, in fact. And so what is it about morality that, I'm still coming back to this question, that makes you take a step from a law or a principle to a person as the Son of God? Where does that happen?
Yeah. So I think the example of the Pharisees and their skepticism of Christ is interesting, because it actually looks kind of a lot like what happens when you take an intense care for morality and lose some of that sense of metaphysics or connection to the highest questions, right? The Pharisees are not unlike, in some ways, my deontology, where it's, I want a rule for doing well. I want to know I can apply it. And then I genuinely want to be good, right? The Pharisees are not, in my reading, which I think is non-heretical, actively trying to be obstreperous and terrible all the time. They may have that effect, but they have it often through an earnest pursuit of doing the good and wanting to love and serve God, but wanting the way in which they do that to be comprehensible enough to them and easy enough to follow and nicely written out. Without that connection to, where do these rules come from, what are they aiming at, not just what are they telling you to do right now. And so for me, again, it's pursuing those questions that led me to Christ, which is, when people ask, virtue ethics, what is the telos you're talking about, what are people supposed to be like? The answer is Christ, that we're given Christ as our destination. And then we see through the saints, the unbelievable diversity of what kind of refractions of that goodness look like. When you take the complete goodness of God and reflect it down at the scale of an individual life, we see all these diverse, wonderful, often bizarre saints. Selflessness and joy of Maximilian Kolbe, the implacable fierceness of St. Catherine of Siena, the nerdiness of Blessed Raymond Lowe. And by doing that, again, often that's kind of how I come to know Christ, who's almost too large to look at full on. So it is a lot of those little oblique things, or almost using the saints as a pinhole camera to understand holiness better through their small examples, and then I kind of assemble up my better understanding of his large one.
Maybe the burning question is, what were you drinking when you were toasting? Wine or booze?
Well, I was having all these problems before the toasting cup even reached me. But in general, the toasting cups of my party are assembled by the Chancellor through a mysterious process I don't actually understand. But when I'm very lucky, sometimes they've been lit on fire before they're brought out. That's obviously aesthetically best.
Thank you for the talk, Leah. What do you say to those in our generation that has a very strong sense of structural sin and a very strong sense of duty to maybe not harm the other physically or emotionally and to be politically correct and all that we hear about so much, including at your alma mater recently, but a lack of the sense of personal sin, or in other words, like virtue ethics or a duty to do, that you can do wrong?
I've not ever gotten that question before. Let me think for a second. So first of all, I think that it is good to kind of recognize, as you were just saying, that a lot of fights over political correctness come out of a desire to not harm others. And honestly, out of like a large and healthy level of like epistemological modesty of, oh man, I want to not harm others, and I'm not sure which things those are. Like, maybe I should draw the bounds like very conservatively and not do a lot of things. Like, maybe I should not do a small range of things. But no one has told me where to draw the bounds, and everything has become much more stressful very fast. But all that comes out of like a good and correct care for others. I think one way to extend that is just to go, okay, like then there are some things where like the practical applications of how not to harm others are hard, but like the question of how not to harm them is easy. Like, don't like insult people. And then the problem is really we don't understand all the gradations of insult that feel insulting to receive, but don't feel insulting to you when you're saying that is like one of those. But you do have kind of the other things like, okay, like, so don't actively harm people. Like, don't run up and kick them in the shins. Like, that's really important. I'm in no way downgrading that. And if that's like one of your biggest problems, work on it. But that's really all about kind of a negative relationship to others, about not harming them further. And it's not about kind of flourishing. So this, and it's completely important. But I think the second question is, all right, like you have this incredible attachment to like being good to others. That's excellent. And we've just been talking about negative ways of being good to others by not actively being terrible to them in all times and all places, which is super important. But really the question is like, if you could get beyond that, or if you could do something more for someone, what would that look like? What is the opposite of kicking people in the shins? It's not kicking them in the shins, right? It's someone giving them better shins, but for their whole life.
The thing for me that is the key to kind of connecting both sides of the argument, the conceptual side and Jesus, to me, is salvation history, and the fact that Jesus is part of the Trinity, and that salvation history is about the reuniting of humanity. So it's that family relational model, which, to me, from John Paul to more grassroots theology, like someone like Scott Hahn, it like just makes sense that, as St. Thomas said, we don't love our enemy because he's our enemy, but because we're both children of the same God. So if you want to kind of understand just war, to me it almost explains everything. You know, if you were fighting your brother and your brother was trying to kill you, you could defend yourself, but you wouldn't just, you know, you wouldn't conduct absolute war against your brother or sister. So I think, you know, when you think of today and these social justice warriors and PC, you know, campaigns, it's almost as if this radical individualism that young people grow up in, that we have this discommunion. And when you have that, all that you end up with is this, I'm going to do, you know, I'm going to be purely right. And you end up warring against everyone else, and you end up eventually where the Marxists were, where, you know, we have to kill people in order to create a just world, or we have to get rid of people, the bad people. It becomes a very Manichaean sort of thing. I don't know if that, I mean, to me, that's kind of the key to, and that's kind of the role of the church, is to knit humanity back together again.
Yeah, I think that relational part is essential, and it is a part of the salvation story. And I think, you know, the absence of that is what leads to any kind of culture of people being disposable. of people being discardable. And I don't just mean, in terms of their lives, certainly that, but, whenever you get to the point where you don't care about the good of the other, which is, honestly, that was the error I was making when I only wanted to be good to Molly in order to not be, disrupted by her being bad, but didn't care about her own anger or her own experience. It would indeed have been a failure in treating her as discardable if I went, Molly is causing me problems, I will go murder her, then there will be no more problems. It also would have been tactically very foolish. But it was no less seeing her as ultimately discardable to not care about her anger or her life. Again, this is the difference between kind of negative, avoiding harm. I was not frustrating her ability to flourish by not caring about her, but I wasn't helping her either. I was treating her as irrelevant to me. I was discarding her. I think if you want to talk about kind of PC culture or anything, I think that's often the part that is both really hard, but missing a little bit from some of the rhetoric that goes on. And now I'm just going to refer back to stuff at high school because I know that better. That we do expect that we'll harm people inadvertently, sometimes on purpose. And the best thing is not to harm people in that way. And that's where a lot of that discussion over language and over aggression is coming from. How do I stop harming people? But the flip side to that is okay, but I also expect people are going to keep harming each other, in the transition, actually for a very long time. And so part of the process of having a relational thing with other people that goes beyond just not having harmed them, but actually loving them is, okay, and after I've wronged you, what are we going to do next? Because I cannot credibly make the promise to not wrong you. Because even if I go and become an anchorite, unless that was actually my vocation, I'm harming you by trying to solve this problem by removing myself from you. So when I next wrong you, what will we do next? And that's where I really love your example of thinking about the world, thinking about even enemies like brothers. Because you can't ever solve problems within a family permanently by just stopping having a relationship that lingers as a wound. It might be tactically important for a short time, but it never represents a healing. It's always then still there as a wound. And that's still even true, again, at that very small level, that for as long as I didn't care about Molly's good, even though our relationship, as I understood, was just being people, what our relationship was a breach and a wound. And then the challenge is, all right, when we break our relationship, when something goes wrong, what will we do next? And assuming the answer will be in some way heal it or knit it back together. And that's where one interesting tradition, I'll mention a spiritual tradition and then a secular one. One thing I do spiritually is that's where I often turn in prayer to Mary because of that very relational thing, because I can kind of pray in the sense of well, we are both like your children. Mothers never actually want to solve problems by wishing the destruction of the child that is wrong. Even when they're super wrong, no one could ever go my brother bit me, and your mom would come back and go well, let him be annihilated, right? Or even my brother defrauded me. Oh, well, let him be erased from existence. Never, right? And so that's why I feel I can really trust turning to Mary in prayer and putting the matter in her hands, because what she wants will ultimately be oriented towards the good of both of us. And then when it comes to the secular traditions, once you could invite a friend into who didn't feel comfortable praying, I think the way people do kind of reconciliation circles is really interesting. It's something that's happened in Rwanda after the genocide, which is the largest possible problem you could be trying to solve, and so the expectation that solving it doesn't just mean justice, but it means healing and a reforging of relationships. You see it also in some kind of prison traditions, where there are circles between victims and assailants, where the expectation is fully coming out on the other side of the crime means having a new, better relationship between these people, rather than just one person suffering enough to make it up to the first person who suffered.
I'm going to ask you a question because it sparked in what you said. But it seems to me that often in this attempt at trying to make sense of the relationship with Christ and with others, but there are some wounds that you cannot heal, right? There are some pains, there are some needs, there are some desires that, like St. Paul would have said, poke at the side of our flesh like a thorn. Within the context of trying to make sense of these things, in the process of your conversion, how did those things, which were not manageable with the experience of logic and reason, how did those things, how did you deal with those things? How do you deal with those things?
It's funny you said not manageable with logic and reason, because of course my approach was like relying equally on Christ and on my previous knowledge of mathematics. Because people do indeed run into problems that are too large, temptations that are too great, issues we don't know how to solve, both at the very large, where someone has like deeply and gravely wounded you, but then again also at the small and embarrassing, right? A lot of the sins we commit again and again aren't, I keep being unable to forgive the man who murdered my entire family and burned my house down, and then the house I moved to after that, and then the house I moved to after that. It's not that we always have a titanic task before us and fall short. One of my wounded relationships is that I have a person who's in my acquaintanceship circle who I find irritating, and I keep preferring not to see her, and it's not very exciting. And then you're just like, oh, Leah, what a burden that's been laid on you there, right? It's embarrassing. I know I'm kind of in no way being Christ to her all the time without kind of a titanic barrier being placed in my way, and I still get stuck. And so what I do there is, I really do trust in Christ, but because I've had less practice doing this, I trust in Christ by thinking about math first and then getting to Christ. So if you're familiar with proofs by induction, proofs by induction are when you kind of prove a proposition is true for some base case, for some initial domino, and then you show that if it's true for one thing, it's true for everything else. But I kind of rely on prayers by induction, that I don't want to ever kind of make prayers that are lies. I don't want to go, to say Christ, please, assist me in loving this person who I find vaguely irritated. Because often I don't even want that prayer to be answered. I know that's the right prayer, but I don't mean it honestly. Or bring her fully into my life in a full and beautiful and flourishing relationship. No, actually, less, please. And I don't want to offer prayers that are lies, right? Because again, our relationship with Christ is relational, and I wouldn't really spend all my time lying to anyone else and expect that to be a real relationship. I don't want to pray Christ, please make this person hang out with me less, because that's not the right prayer either. And I know I kind of don't want it to its logical conclusion, but in the moment I totally want it. So what I do is kind of do this prayer by induction, where I say all right, it might be correct to pray that I truly will this person's good, and I joyfully spend time with them, and something, I don't even know what comes after that, it's hard to picture at the moment. I can't offer that prayer in earnest. So that's the farther away domino. And what I can pray for today is I don't love this person, and I don't particularly want to. But I ask for the grace to want to love them. I ask for the grace to offer the prayer that I know is actually the correct prayer, but I cannot offer honestly today. And some say, I can't do that one. Some no, but if I prayed that and Christ granted it to me, then I would want a relationship with her. I totally don't. And then I just add more dominoes, right? So I'm all right, the first prayer is actually loving her. The second prayer is wanting to love her. And the third prayer, the one I'm offering today, is Christ, grant me the grace to be able to pray, for the grace to be able to love this person who's annoying me. Which has the benefit of being honest, of being efficacious in that if Christ grants me this prayer, then I can make the next one, and then if he grants, and then I can go on. It's lined up in the right order. Of being a prayer I know Christ longs to grant. Right? This is very different than my first impulse prayer, let her move to a different city, which I know that's not actually in accord with what Christ wants from me or from her. So now I'm asking for something that I know Christ is longing for me to ask for. And it's kind of a bonus. For me, honestly, it's sometimes hard to approach my relationship with Christ because I've spent so much time, my whole habit is thinking I'm analytically here and about the truth proposition, but not the person. And it's easy for me to kind of slip back into that. Well, what claims can I make about Christ? It is true he endorses this prayer, which is different than actually feeling it. And there is something about just the abject ridiculousness of my prayers when I line them up in this way that does put me back into contact with that sense of relationship with Christ. It makes me feel like I am to Christ as my friend's 3-month-old is when she's trying to gnaw on her own hand and is but like pulls it away through an involuntary movement, and it's just like distressed, right? Because she had a hand, and now it's gone, and everything is terrible. Oh, and then like she starts eating it again. And when I see her like being completely ridiculous, right? Like Brisington is like kind of a little crazy in a completely bonkers way. Like I still feel very fond of her. And I feel like with some of my prayers that must be the spirit in which Christ used me, right? Like, wow, like 4 dominoes today, Leah.